partners and colleagues, good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all from whichever time zone or continent you are joining us today. On behalf of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by the Global Standards Proportionality Working Group and on the topic of virtual assets regulation, aligning inclusion and integrity goals. This is the last in the current series of the GSP technical webinars over the summer before we break for the AFI regional initiatives and the annual general meeting in the next weeks. And today we do have really an exceptional set of speakers joining us. And we very much hope you'll enjoy the webinar over the next hour and a half. I'd also like to acknowledge at this time the presence of AFI Deputy Executive Director, Mr. Norbert Mumba, as well as our partners from the Financial Action Task Force regional bodies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Please allow me to run you briefly through the agenda for the webinar. Shortly, we will hear opening remarks from GSPWG co-chair, Mr. Syed Mohsin Sadat of the Afghanistan Bank. Next, we are going to take the pulse in the room a little bit on today's topic with a few polling questions for the audience before we commence our panel discussion with 4 guest speakers representing a variety of perspectives, both from the private sector as well as the vantage point of the regulator. Finally, we will invite audience questions before summarizing and wrapping up the session. It's my pleasure to invite the GSPWG co-chair, Syed Mohsin Sadat of the Afghanistan Bank, the Central Bank of Afghanistan, for his opening remarks. Syed is a Deputy Director General in the Non-Bank Supervision Department at the Central Bank of Afghanistan. He has extensive expertise in regulation, supervision, and financial inclusion policy, and he's also an experienced speaker and practitioner on subject matter around fintech and the digital economy. So Syed, please, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much, Robin, for your wonderful introduction. Indeed, I'm so excited for that. AFI members and partners, warm greetings to you all. And thank you for joining the Global Standard Proportionality Working Group webinar today on the subject of virtual asset regulation. The topic of virtual asset regulation, which our panel will discuss today, is both timely and important. As policymakers and regulators in AFI, we share a commitment, the vision of financial inclusion for all. Yet we also pursue this goal in the environment where the safety and soundness of financial system must be maintained by implementing the global standards to the design to protection of these goals and values. As one example, the risk and the cost to the society of money laundering and terrorist financing are very real and must be assessed and mitigated. Similarly, these efforts should not come at the expense of innovation or inclusion in the formal financial system. Aligning the goals of financial inclusion and financial integrity has therefore been key focuses of this group, leading to the development of Inclusive Financial Integrity Toolkit published just last Monday. When we look at the topic of virtual asset, which is known as cryptocurrencies, and we know Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies in the market, we are examining a new technology, but effectively applying the same principles. The virtual asset sector has grown very significantly from the origin with the creation of Bitcoin in 2018 to reach combined market capitalization of more than 270 billion. Yes, 270 billion as June of 2020. We need to recognize the real money laundering and terrorist financing risk arising from the use of these virtual assets, particularly given the potential speed and the cross-border nature of the transaction, as well as the accuracy and anomaly offered by some cryptocurrencies. At the same time, we need to recognize that such innovation may hold to tackle long-term challenges which hold back progress towards financial inclusion and economic inclusion, such as speed and cost of the cross-border payments or social transfer from the governments, not to mention the increasingly common use of virtual asset as a safeguard against inflation in some developing countries as well. We need, in other words, we need to regulate according to the nature of risk, the potential of risk, and the financial integrity, consumer protection, and ultimately, most importantly, the financial stability. But to maintain at the same time, maintaining these goals, we need to have a very neutral approach towards the development of innovation and inclusion. AFI members have accordingly identified the topic of virtual asset regulation as one of the AFI should support further for peer learning on policy approaches and capacity building on the technology and use cases, including through dialogue with providers and ecosystem players. So this webinar is part of our journey to build understanding, and this will inform the next steps of standard proportionality we'll take in further building the knowledge base and developing policy guidance. On behalf of the GSP chair and co-chairs, I would like to thank you all the panelists who will be sharing their insight with us today. I'm looking forward to be enlightening discussion and having fruitful sessions and to work together with the GSP working group members and our partners to further advance knowledge sharing and implementation of practical solutions within these important policy areas. Thank you so much. Looking for the discussions of the panelists and the question of the participant. Thank you so much, Robin, again.
Thank you very much indeed, Syed, for your opening remarks. Now, before we go further and introduce the panel, we would like to get some of your views in the audience on the topic that we have before us today, as outlined by Syed. So we have three polling questions, and I'd like to ask if they could be please shown on the screen now. Thank you. So for anyone who cannot read the questions, I will read them out. The first question is, are virtual assets or cryptocurrencies beneficial to or harming for financial inclusion? So do you think that virtual assets are already beneficial to financial inclusion? Perhaps that there's no impact yet, but they could be beneficial in the future? Or do you feel there's no benefits to financial inclusion? Or on the other hand, do you actually perceive that virtual assets could be harmful for financial inclusion? The second question is, how do you assess the money laundering and terrorist financing risks arising from virtual assets or cryptocurrencies? And the options are A, an unacceptably high level of risk, B, significant risks but containable with controls, C, about the same level of risk as cash, or D, actually a lower risk compared to cash. And then the third question, we would like to get your view on effective regulation of virtual assets or cryptocurrencies. So do you feel that effective regulation requires A, a globally coordinated regulatory framework, B, tailored regulatory actions but at the national level, C, you feel that regulation of virtual assets is actually unnecessary, or final option D, virtual assets should be prohibited altogether, not regulated? So we'll just give you a couple of minutes now to complete those three questions, and then we'll post the results. So I can see that just over 70% of the participants have voted. I think that's a pretty good evidence base. So I think if we could have the final results shared, please. We're up to 75% now. Yes, thank you. So on the first question, that's very interesting that 90% actually of you feel that virtual assets are either already benefiting financial inclusion or could be in the future. So that's actually a very positive view. Even if you do not see the impact today, you feel the potential is there for positive impact in the future. And a very small number of respondents felt that there would be no benefits or that virtual assets would be harmful. And I think most of our panelists will be very happy to see that result. On the second question around perceptions of money laundering and terrorist financing risks, can see there's a clear consensus there, 75% saying significant risks, but actually containable with controls. So this seems not to be a level of risk that cannot be managed through appropriate regulatory and perhaps technological solutions as well. And 10% even felt that the risk is lower compared to physical cash, which is interesting too. And then finally, on regulation, I think we've got a very strong consensus there, 87% calling for global coordination of a regulatory framework, and the remaining 30% for national regulatory actions. I guess perhaps those in favor of prohibiting virtual assets might not be signing up to this webinar in the first place, so it may not be fully representative, but we can see the demand there for global coordination, global dialogue on this topic. And we actually asked this question as well at last year's Global Policy Forum, pretty much 12 months ago. And at that time, I think 70% expressed support for a global framework. So that's even higher here, which may be signs of an interesting trend. So with that, those interesting findings, let me move on now and introduce today's panelists. And so we've heard already from Syed in his opening remarks the importance of really retaining policy alignment between the objectives of inclusion and innovation on the one hand, and considerations around financial stability and especially perhaps financial integrity on the other hand. And there's no doubt that we are seeing increasing attention and perhaps even pressure from global standard setting bodies as well as national regulatory authorities to manage and mitigate the risks that are associated with virtual assets. Yet, of course, we need to be mindful at the same time of the need to avoid unintended consequences that might arise for useful innovation, and particularly where those innovations can potentially address inclusion goals, as the majority of you here on this webinar seem to think that they can. So to explore this topic with us today, I'm delighted to welcome 4 guest speakers. I'll introduce them in turn. So firstly, we have Jay Ramaswamy. Jay leads risk, regulatory, and compliance matters at cLabs, working on Celo, an open source distributed ledger protocol designed to support financial tools for those on the margins of the financial system. He previously worked for Capital One, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and the US Department of Justice, amongst others. Secondly, we will hear from Liat Shetret, Senior Advisor for Crypto Policy and Regulation at Elliptic, whose work we will hear more about shortly. Liat has previously led global AML-CFT programs, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa as well, and has worked for, amongst others, the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, Citigroup, and the Global Center on Cooperative Security. Next, we will have the regulators' perspective from Melchor Plabasan, from the Central Bank of the Philippines. Mel is officer in charge of the Technology, Risk and Innovation Department at the BSP, in which capacity he oversees the supervision of technology as well as cybersecurity risk. And he has played a key role in shaping a progressive approach on technology risk and innovation supervision, as well as in promoting a secure and resilient financial ecosystem in the Philippines. And finally, we will hear from Sean Jones, a senior partner at XReg Consulting, where Sean has led a global initiative to develop technical standards to enable virtual asset service providers to rapidly respond to financial action task force recommendations around money laundering, terrorist financing. She has been a technical expert as well on virtual assets in the FATF's policy development group and has previously worked at the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission as a senior advisor on distributed ledger technologies. So I think it's safe to say we are in very good hands indeed today, and we're fortunate to have such experts in the field with us. So please do welcome them with a virtual round of applause. The format now is going to be for each speaker to make a short introductory presentation, and then we will transition into a panel discussion around common themes. And finally, we'll allow plenty of time for the audience Q&A segment. As mentioned, do feel free to write down your questions at any time using the Q&A tab. And if we don't address them right away, we will come back to them in the final question and answer session. So with that, I'd like to please start with Jay. And I'd like to ask you, Jay, if you could please introduce us to cLabs and Celo, and particularly the role that you think virtual assets can play in financial inclusion, as well as the regulatory and compliance challenges as you see them. Over to you, Jay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robin. First off, I just want to thank Robin and Afi for inviting me to speak to this audience and with this a really esteemed panel of colleagues. I think and hope that this will be a great discussion. The first thing I want to start off with is that I firmly believe the goals of financial inclusion and financial integrity have some tensions, but are not at odds with one another. And Robin already went through my bio, so I'll just briefly give you a sense of my background to understand why I believe that. But I'm currently the head of global risk, regulatory, and compliance, as Robin mentioned, at cLabs. And I'm new to the crypto or blockchain space. I actually have a background in traditional financial services and enterprise risk management, AML compliance at two large financial institutions in the United States, as well as in the case of Bank of America, global financial institution. But I came from the government and from the sort of criminal prosecution and money laundering background, particularly as the head of the money laundering section at the US Department of Justice, where we were responsible for the criminal enforcement of AML and sanctions compliance against violations against financial institutions or by financial institutions. And by that, you know, had extensive sympathy and the approach that governments are taking in this area, because I think it's incredibly important. And so I start off with that just to give you a sense that the industry itself is developing rapidly. And if we can advance the next slide, please. And has really been able to attract people who are interested in both goals, in goals of financial inclusion, as well as in goals of financial integrity. And the entity I work for is cLabs, which was responsible for developing the code, the open source code, that Celo, the Celo platform, which I'll describe in a few minutes, is based on, with contributions from a global community. And the important thing to recognize is that the Celo project itself is at its heart a project about financial inclusion. The mission is financial inclusion, and extensive field research was conducted by the project before even settling on the technology. And to us, blockchain, cryptocurrency, cryptographic protocols, however you want to call them, distributed ledger technology, are a means to an end. And after exploring a number of different alternatives, we came to the conclusion that this particular technology had some real features that were important for driving financial inclusion, was able to attract a number of different folks from a variety of backgrounds, from academia, from technology, as well as from the public sector. And as part of what we've put together, cLabs is a member of 100+ companies we're also in an alliance, like the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, known as the Alliance for Prosperity, who are like-minded companies interested in developing on Celo using the technology to drive financial inclusion, to really address the needs of those who currently are on the margins of the financial system. Next slide, please. So what is Celo? And Robin gave you a quick overview of it. The best way to think about it is it's an open cryptographic protocol that allows applications to be built on top of it, that allows transactions to occur in a secure and decentralized fashion. And most importantly, one of the things that we've focused on in our technology, and I'm going to focus on the Celo technology because it's the one that I'm most familiar with, but I think it's important to recognize that innovation is advancing rapidly in this area. And it's one of the things just to keep in mind. Even where we were 10 years ago is not where we are today. And I'll describe some of those changing attributes that are, I think, great for financial inclusion, but also potentially for financial integrity. But Celo itself is really intended as a platform for people, organizations, institutions, and regulated institutions to build tools accessible to anyone with a mobile phone. Next slide, please. And that's important because one thing that our research had indicated is that one of the blockers to the adoption of cryptocurrencies in general is ease of use, volatility of the asset, as well as just overall functioning in a way that's understandable to individuals. And I sort of analogize it to, we all use electricity today. It's a brilliant invention that has transformed the lives of millions across the globe. But when you turn on the light switch, you don't necessarily know what's happening. And today, in our sort of stage where we are, the use of cryptocurrencies, the use of distributed ledger technology still takes technological expertise that's difficult to overcome. And so one of the hallmarks of the Celo project was developing in a technology world, and I'm not a technologist, so excuse me for ventriloquizing technologists to this audience, and I'll try not to get too technical, but was to adopt what's called a full stack approach. And by that, it's to really make sure that all aspects of the platform are tied together. And so there's the blockchain, which is the underlying technology, but we also introduced an open source software development kit. So developers could easily develop applications on this software. And then finally, one aspect which hasn't been released yet is cLabs itself is working on one version of a wallet, a software wallet that could be used on this platform, which hasn't been released yet. Likely in the next several months, it will be released in the various stores, the app stores that you know of. But that full stack approach is incredibly important to ensuring that users and ordinary users can use this in a way that's non-mystical and that they understand, and that's key to driving, I think, this adoption in this area. A couple of other things, if you'll advance to the next slide. What's unique about the Celo platform itself is that the techniques that are used, the technical bones, if you will, of the technology are inherently mobile first. And second, they're allow the use of stable value assets. The first one that's introduced on the platform is tied to the US dollar to permit some stability and value. And third, the technology permits people to send money using simple cell phone numbers, as opposed to the traditional cryptographic hashes that are used as addresses, which are oftentimes complicated to understand. And so it offers the potential to be an M-Pesa or an experience where you can use an identifier that you already know of people to send them assets back and forth. But potentially more importantly is some of the technical advancements. And I get into this just to give you a sense of how quickly innovation is developing in this space. So Bitcoin, which was the first of the distributed ledger technologies, relied on something called proof of work, which was incredibly, by design, energy intensive and has proved to be relatively environmentally unfriendly in the long term. But the subsequent generation of technologies, such as Celo, that are emerging are based on other types of protocols known as proof of stake, which you may have heard of, proof of authority, which really allow you to operate these types of networks on data limited mobile phones. And by that, I mean not just kind of your $1,000 smartphone that you may be able to get in Europe or the United States, and many people have, but on inexpensive data limited phones, where data may be, even access to data may be limited. And that's incredibly important from a financial inclusion point of view. And so as this space develops rapidly, and we sort of say in the industry that the past 10 years has seen incredible advancements in this technology. I put that front and center just as policymakers are thinking of this area, to realize that you want to make sure that that type of innovation that's really advancing and that has the potential to really address pain points for the financially marginalized continues at the pace that it's continuing at, because it really does solve some fundamental engineering problems, some fundamental problems before that would have made this a little bit more difficult to be used by those who potentially need it the most. Next slide, please. Just to give you a really high overview of some of the things that are being thought about on the platform. And to be clear, we're at a relatively early stage of maturity. We're experiencing organic growth, but we're at the point where use cases are just being developed. And I just want to give you a sense of a handful of use cases being developed in which Celo is involved. Other Alliance members are involved as well, to give you a sense of the potential for this. And they come in, for example, the case of COVID relief programs, which are very timely. We're working with partners on a potential pilot where Celo could, because of its programmable nature, could be used to provide us targeted assistance. For example, allowing users or holders of this who are given grants by, in this case, the Grameen Foundation that we're working with, to pay groceries and pharmaceuticals. And because of the programmable nature of money, that relief can be targeted. It also reduces the financial crimes risk, if you will, because it can only be used at certain vendors in a way that cash couldn't be. But it also maintains the underlying economy and exchange in a way that direct programs giving direct aid can't do. And so it's a nice marriage of both worlds of cash giving and the need for cash giving, as well as the need to ensure that the money gets to people who need it in the way that they need to. And this is a small closed program, but nonetheless, one that I think shows the potential that we can use these technologies for. A second is a great partnership we've entered in with Mercy Corps, World Food Program, and Oppen, an AI provider, where those working on, living off on $300 a month can earn up to $30 in Celo, again, a closed program, but doing micro work, which is the kind of thing that allows, for example, training on for AI algorithms on their smartphones. And this has been piloted in developing countries and has and is showing real promise. But it's really not possible with current systems because of the cost, which can oftentimes eat up close to $10 or $5 in a transaction that is only $30 per month. And so micropayments become really possible on these platforms. Stimulus vouchers, and I'll go through these very quickly because I know we're don't want to take up other people's time, but stimulus vouchers, we're in some preliminary discussions about, because of the programmable nature of money, could you shape conditional transfer vouchers, including demurrage to encourage spending? So demurrage are negative interest rates. And we have an active program with some of the folks who have experience in the public sector, including the Federal Reserve, thinking about this. And then finally, working with the World Bank on a prototype to allow the traceability of funds that are being used for disbursements in various programs. And so very small subset of things that are possible here, but I just wanted to give you a flavor, and we can go into it more later, of really the potential here, so that you see that this is a rapidly advancing technology. It has real use cases. And then finally, next slide, just a couple of ways that we're thinking about regulation. As I said, I wouldn't have started working for this project unless there was a real desire to marry integrity, financial integrity, and financial inclusion. But the way we're thinking about the platform is sort of threefold. In the software wallet that we would produce, we're imposing transaction limits that are consistent with FATF guidelines around how VASPs should think about KYC, and then identity verification in our software wallet, even though software wallets currently are outside the ambit of regulatory approval in most jurisdictions, not all, but in several, including the United States. But really maintaining identity verification if you want to go above that limit. And that's the idea there, is to, again, marry financial inclusion and integrity goals. So maintain for lower risk transactions, cash-like features, whereas for higher risk transactions, ensure there's controls. Any VASPs or virtual asset service providers that build on the network obviously would have to do KYC and are subject to regulations to do it. And then just some additional controls as membership in the Alliance increases, where we've been setting up a committee that's focused on driving the culture of compliance within the platform and players on the platform to share best practices and to facilitate information sharing. And then finally, and I'll get into this quickly because this is something I think Liat will address much more in her thing, but the transparent nature of the blockchain allows you to mitigate residual risk in a way that traditional cash transactions don't, because you have the immutable history of the transactions. Next slide. And just to give you a sense of differences between traditional risk management and public blockchain monitoring and risk management, I'm on the side that actually looks at potentially the risks in this space as being lower than in the cash space. And so I'm in that minority, I think, of people in that. Not because I do not take seriously the risk here, but because of the mitigating factors. So in traditional transactional monitoring, your customer relationship determines what you see. Whereas in blockchain monitoring, anyone who has access to the blockchain can see the history of transaction and can do analytics, as Elliptic does, as Liat will talk about. Information sharing is by default. So whereas information sharing in traditional financial systems and for law enforcement, where I work, required multilateral treaty assistant requests, coordination, cooperation. What we found in instances in investigations on the blockchain is that's instantaneous because it's all public and information can be shared, certainly about the transaction, if not the customers themselves, where there is still need for cooperation. Traceability is far easier on the blockchain and has proved far easier than it is with cash transactions. And then finally, because as I worked in banks, and I know transaction data within institutions is really siloed, and they're in different formats and different ways. Applying advanced analytic techniques is actually much more difficult in financial institutions that are traditional because of the data quality issues. Whereas on the blockchain, again, it's consistent, open, and available. And so I think the risk management potential of transaction monitoring in this space, as has been shown, I think, in the recent examples of the Twitter hack that happened and was quickly investigated, as is in the case of Welcome to Video, a child sexual abuse material case. There's real potential to do forensic investigations in a way that I think expands abilities beyond the traditional financial system. So with that, I know I'm out of time. I want to turn it over back to Robin to have some of the other panelists. But thank you again for letting me present today.
Thanks very much, Jay. That was very comprehensive. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to some of the issues you've addressed, both on the inclusion side and also the integrity concerns during the discussion later. But I would now like to bring in Liat from Elliptic. And Liat, please, if you could tell us what you're working on at Elliptic and how you're dealing with some of those risks and compliance challenges arising from virtual assets that Jay outlined in the last presentation. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Robin. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you again to Robin, Dieter, and to Afi for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today. I'm so pleased to be here with you to talk about one of my favorite topics, financial inclusion and anti-money laundering. I'd like to warmly congratulate Afi for the publication of the impressive Inclusive Financial Integrity Toolkit, which truly lives Afi's value and tagline of bringing smart policies to life. So by way of introduction, I'm Liat Shetret, Senior Advisor for Crypto Policy and Regulation at Elliptic, which is a blockchain analytics company out of London, New York, and Tokyo, as well as Singapore. Elliptic's mission is to protect against financial crime in cryptocurrencies and virtual assets. We do this by providing technology that helps crypto businesses, banks, financial institutions, and governments with regulatory compliance solutions specific to virtual assets. We do wallet screening, transaction monitoring, forensic investigations, and read or interpret the blockchain to identify and flag illicit entities and activities. So my key assumption throughout my comments is that financial inclusion and anti-money laundering, counterterrorism finance are not in conflict, but rather are interdependent and are two sides of the same coin, though tensions do emerge in practice and applications. And I think that assessing and addressing those tensions in practice and operations is one way that really helps us dissolve kind of some of the challenges. So if we were in a physical room right now, I would likely be shaking your hand and introducing myself. And so as not to be rude, I've included this introductory slide here, but I'll go ahead and just skip this one altogether and thank Robin for the kind introduction. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So in the AFI toolkit, there's a good discussion of important data issues, data challenges, and the struggles around data governance and data analysis, as well as the statistical ecosystems that are really difficult to maintain and standardize, particularly across jurisdictions. When it comes to virtual assets and its underlying technology of the blockchain, one of the immediate characteristics that come to mind is the richness of the blockchain, particularly the data richness. What you see here in this image is a simplified view of what kind of information can be gleaned from a blockchain. So each dot is an address that is then interlinked with transactions that occur between dots, so between addresses. And when we apply proper data research methodologies that gather data from specific bad actors, so think about dark markets, as well as enrich that information with additional data science to look at patterns, we're able to effectively group addresses together with very high levels of accuracy, and this is what we call clustering. So from this image of seemingly random strings of letters and numbers, we begin to see a clear picture. If we can go to the next slide, please. So a view of transactions in groups or clusters brings this clear picture into focus. And at the entity level, we have an ability to see who is transacting with whom. And this alone is a robust characteristic of virtual assets and is often referred to as the openness of the ledger. So this ability to connect between Silk Road transactions and say crypto businesses, different kinds of crypto exchanges around the world, no matter where they are interacting with each other. You can see that on the blockchain through these techniques of clustering. So in my presentation today, I'd like to show you operational and practical ways in which technology solutions enhance compliance in the sector and really safeguard financial integrity. One of my key takeaways is this idea that a robust AML-CFT regulatory framework can be applied to virtual assets effectively, and these in fact may meet or exceed bread and butter tools we're all familiar with in our financial system, particularly around cash. Next slide, please. So on the left here, I have a short list of those characteristics of crypto assets. So we often speak of crypto assets or virtual assets as being decentralized, borderless, censorship resistant, meaning that they can't be altered or changed by, say, a third party. We talk about them being pseudonymous, meaning you and your account are recognized by those strings of letters and numbers we saw earlier. There's the use of cryptography for the protection of information and communication. Use of codes and crypto assets are math-based and blockchain-based. On the right side, I have an image of the AML-CFT Elliptic product suite, which delivered tools and solutions that rely upon comprehensive blockchain data to aid an entity know your customer. This is the first piece in discovery. The screening of wallets, which is titled Lens. Conducting transaction monitoring, which is Navigator. And deep dive investigations of incidents, which is the fourth tool here called Forensics. Now, how do these really support inclusion? So by offering traceability and living up to the FATF standards, as well as to national regulatory regimes, we often talk about technology and innovation as offering both risks and opportunities. And today I'd like to really focus on the opportunities that we've identified at Elliptic to securing financial integrity, and in that sense, making the space of virtual assets safer and hopefully broader for inclusion. So to show you quite specifically what I mean, I'm going to stop with the theoretical slides and really move into kind of the meat of it. And as I said, the operational pieces to really show you what I mean and share some screenshots from these various tools. So I'm going to share a couple of slides from Discovery, Lens, Navigator, and Forensics to really demonstrate the effectiveness. So next slide, please. Thank you. When it comes to identifying and managing risks, our software has numerous categories of illicit activity, essentially risk rules. Think of this as lists of things like typologies or other kinds of identifiable crimes, and you have a short list here, say Ponzi schemes, scams, malware, dark services, and so on. There are numerous categories of illicit activity, and these risk rules are adjusted by the entity, such as a bank or a crypto exchange, in accordance with the risk-based approach and that entity's risk appetite and risk assessment. So for example, these categories should dovetail with that particular entity's risk appetite and the risk assessment, which is a good way for regulators to immediately match what does the risk assessment indicate as potential issues, and then what are the corresponding controls that that particular entity has put in place. Transactions or wallets are then issued with a rated risk score, and you can see this on the bottom here, based on the various combinations of rules that are triggered between 1 and 10, with 10 being the riskiest and of the utmost concern. Next slide, please. In this screenshot, you can see a high risk wallet up above with a risk score of 10. And I make the point that crypto transactions on the blockchain are visible end to end. This is unlike cash and one of the biggest assets of a blockchain. So imagine being able to know where money came from and where it's going. And it's not just one or two people before you or after you, it's sort of that entire chain of funds movement. So solving directly issues of ultimate beneficial owner and other similar ownership questions is something that the blockchain does as an inherent functionality. So in this specific case here in front of you, we see a wallet address of 10, indicating it being high risk. And when we look at the exposure of the wallet and try to understand why this was assigned, we're able to see the source of the funds in purple. So the source of the funds being an illicit dark market, and the destination of the funds in green, a mixer, which is a service that mixes different streams of potentially identifiable crypto assets together and makes it difficult to trace them separately. So essentially suggesting obfuscation or an interest in blurring identity or ownership. And therefore we would trigger something like this to be a 10, again, based on the risk-based approach and the risk appetite by a particular entity. Next slide, please. So handling sanctions is on everyone's mind quite a bit. And in this slide, I share an example of an immediate binary setting that is triggered an OFAC sanctioned entity or CSAM child sexual abuse materials risk rule. So we see that this wallet controlled by an OFAC listed individual from the Lazarus group in North Korea has in it about $62,000 worth of Bitcoin, and cashing out of this wallet should be near impossible given this flagging of being an OFAC sanctioned entity. And OFAC has recently been listing specific Bitcoin addresses, which has obviously been specifically super helpful in being able to insert that into the tool and therefore flagging those specific sanctioned entities right away. Next slide, please. Similarly, an example of a wallet address with exposure to terrorist financing, which we see in the source of funds on the left as being part of Jahazuna, a terrorist fundraising campaign from ITMC, the media wing of the Mujahideen Shura Council, MSC, based in Gaza. And again, you see where the money came from or originated and what the destination are those funds, and that's by percentage. So it's broken down as funds continue to move in and out of the wallet. Next slide, please. And this is something that Jay has just also mentioned and quite recent in the news is the latest Twitter Bitcoin scam, where we see an inflow of funds into this wallet here. And again, that source of fund was identified as being directly part and parcel of Twitter hacks funds that were received. And if we go to the next slide, this is where we really kind of demonstrate the robustness of the blockchain analytics and the power of the tools. So what I've been showing you so far has been a more simplistic kind of version of where did the money come from, where is it going? But if you were to break down those purple bars, those green bars, you could, using This is Forensics, our tool that really maps out this link chart or analysis between where did money come from and where is it going. So this is really the Twitter hack mapped out as of July 15th. And it's quite powerful to see that within such a short amount of time and very quickly, and we were tracking this live, we were able to see all of the victims who were scammed into sending funds, and were able to track those funds as they began moving through a variety of different mixers to, again, kind of blur the line or blur the source of funds, and then, again, support law enforcement and really capturing the perpetrator. So I think the bottom line here is to also say that traceability in anti-money laundering, counterterrorism finance can be done. It's available, and that's something that supports financial integrity. And I have often a lot to say about the financial inclusion portion of it, and I'm happy to get into that more in the discussion. Thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you, Liat. There's some excellent examples there. And Liat, one question that has come into the chat while you've been speaking is on the balance of transparency, which of course serves the interests of financial integrity, but how to balance that against data privacy and the need of companies, for example, to keep certain information, commercially sensitive information, secret. What's the way to get the right balance between transparency and privacy with blockchain technology?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and is a big kind of ongoing debate. Our perspective on this is that within all Elliptic tools, we don't gather personal identifiable information. The traceability is to the entity level. So for example, to the nearest crypto exchange who maintain the robust KYC, know your customer information down to the person, their ID, their address. So Elliptic doesn't maintain that. But if you think again of the Twitter hack, we're able to trace back to the nearest known entity and then essentially send law enforcement there to figure out, here's a transaction, here's a date, here's an amount, who made this transaction. And this is where regulatory frameworks step in at the national level to say, crypto exchanges should be at this point 100% maintaining solid KYC records. So that remains with that particular commercial entity and isn't something that is widely spread across the blockchain. If that makes sense.
Great, thanks for that clarification. So next, I'd like to bring in Mel. We're going to hear the regulators' perspective. So Mel, please tell us how you're regulating and supervising the virtual assets sector in the Philippines, but also what has been the policy journey that you've taken? What were the key decisions you had to make along the way? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Robin, and to the rest of the AFI leadership for this opportunity to share the BSP's regulatory approach to virtual currencies. And soon, of course, it will be called virtual assets. Next slide, please. So I would like to start with where we are right now. So, but before I do that, let me just give you a quick or a brief history as to how it all started. I mean, in terms of our journey. 2014 was the year when virtual currencies started gaining traction in the Philippines. However, back then, actual holdings remained low given the perceived risk associated with these digital assets. So, considering the limited user acceptance, the BSP, similar to how other jurisdictions approach it, we just issued a public advisory clarifying the nature of virtual currencies and the associated risks of using it. This is also to ensure that the public is aware of key realities, such as the exchange platforms back then are unregulated. VCs are not considered as deposit. They are also outside the regime of our e-money framework. And of course, the BSP does not guarantee the value of virtual currencies. So it's essentially telling them buyer beware, caveat emptor. Next slide, please. So speaking of regulations, okay, continue please. So speaking of regulations, I think Philippines and Japan were one of the first few countries that adopted a regulatory approach for virtual currencies. So we issued the Circular 944, which set forth the guidelines for virtual currency exchanges. So essentially, in this particular circular, we defined what virtual currency is. And we also mentioned, we reiterated that this is not a legal tender outside the e-money regime. And we were very specific that we are adopting a targeted approach. So our focus then is on the exchanges or those entities that facilitate the exchange or conversion of fiat to virtual currency or vice versa. So given that particular targeted approach, BCEs were folded in the BSP's MSB regime. So they are considered as managed service business. And that approach is, I think, largely anchored on the pronouncements of FATF back then, similar to the approach of Japan and also United States of America. Hence, VCEs were required to register with the BSP, and they are all required to comply with the applicable rules on AML, technology risk management, internal controls, consumer protection, and also some reportorial obligations. Next slide. So I already mentioned some of the salient features of Circular 944 on virtual currency exchange. So I mentioned about the region requirement. So all those BCEs or all those entities whose activities can be defined as BCE should register with the BSP as a remittance and transfer company. So as a form of AML, if they are to do cash out transaction amounting to 500,000, so roughly that's around 10,000 US dollars, they have to do it via check or deposit account. So, or direct deposit to a bank account. This is to ensure that there is another layer or additional layer of probably scrutiny, KYC. So I mentioned about the control. These should implement or adapt IT risk management, consumer protection. We also provided certain measures on managing wallet security, security management, information security management, AML practices, and some of the reportorial requirements, AFS, audited financial statements. We have the quarterly volume and value of transactions, and we also specifically provided for supervisory actions or enforcement actions to address non-compliance with the rules. So it can possibly involve revocation of license. Next slide, please. Okay. So as of July 31, 2020, there are about 15 registered VCEs in the Philippines, 5 of which were approved this 2020. And accordingly, virtual currency transactions have also increased amid this pandemic, with total value of virtual currency transactions in the first quarter of 2020 alone higher than the 2019 VC transactions combined. And to add to that, in terms of the year-on-year comparison, so there was a massive increase of 750% comparing first quarter of 2019 versus first quarter of 2020. So the increase was really significant. Next slide, please. So the next question is, where are we heading? I mentioned about replacing VCs, virtual currencies, with virtual asset, and as defined by FATF, and also including VASP, defining the activities of VASP or virtual asset service providers. Next slide, please. So as VCEs continue to surge in terms of users and transactions, of course, different types of risks also continue to evolve. So in the next, probably in the next 2 to 3 months, the BSP will amend its existing rules on VCEs to align with the recent guidance of FATF, that the June 2019 guidance of FATF on virtual assets, and also to enhance our regulatory oversight and supervisory response. So the proposed enhancements would help ensure that virtual asset service providers, all the activities of VASPs are executed within unbroken chain of regulated entities. So in effect, one of the changes of these regulations to expand the scope of activity that fall under the BSP's regulation. So from previously from focusing on the exchange part only, so it shall now be expanded, while we will ensure that additional risk management guidelines and reportorial requirements, let's say to enhance AML-CFT, safety and soundness, what else? Consumer protection, and shall be established. Next slide. So I would just like to show here the expanded scope of the regulation. I mentioned about the unbroken chain of regulated entities. So the green part is the exchange between fiat and virtual currency and vice versa. This will be expanded other activities. Of course, it was the previous regulation has a lot of gaps in terms of the activities that are not covered by existing rules. That's why it's FATF made the amendment back in 2019. So in addition to exchange between fiat and VCs, we will also cover exchange between VA to VA to another VA. We will also cover transfer of virtual assets and VA custodianship. I also included here ICOs, offering or sale of VAs, but it's not within the purview of the BSP, but it will be covered by the forthcoming rules of our Securities and Exchange Commission. Next slide, please. So in summary, the BSP remains supportive and proactive amidst this dynamic innovation and digital transformation, while at the same time exercising commensurate regulatory mechanisms towards the pursuit of our mandates. Thank you once again for this opportunity, Robin and Afi, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone.
Thanks so much, Mal. That's a really interesting policy journey. And I'd just like to ask two quick follow-up questions, actually. The first question, what role do you really see virtual assets and virtual asset service providers playing in the financial inclusion strategy that sits under the BSP? And secondly, given that, as you say, you are one of the first regulators, certainly in the developing world, to have a regulatory regime for VASPs, is there anything that you would have done differently that you could share with other members who may be just starting out in this journey? Thank you.
Yeah. On the first question, Robin, I think in terms of impact to financial institution, we've seen and we have worked with institutions utilize virtual assets for domestic and international remittance. It essentially made remittance more efficient. So we've seen pilots wherein an overseas Filipino worker in Singapore can send directly in near real time to a Parplang island in the Philippines. So remittance is one. We also see, although this is not yet live, we also see the potential of using tokenized asset, which can serve as the digital identity of individuals in a blockchain environment. That's also, of course, although this may not have impact on financial inclusion, in terms of, let's say, settlement of securities, we can minimize reconciliation because the settlement can be real time. So those are just some of the, and right now we're also talking to a blockchain provider which has interest on digitizing titles to condominiums. So that can also make the process of verifying titles to properties. So on the second question, because right now we are talking to different vendors or service providers of blockchain analysis tools. We previously talked with Elliptic, with Chainalysis. So the intention is to strengthen our oversight capability. We should have done that since 2018 or 2019. That's one of the areas that we can further improve.
Thanks so much, Mal. That's really interesting. Now, I'd like to bring in now Siân. And Siân, you've been waiting there very patiently, but love to invite you now to tell us a bit about your work, both in terms of the FATF process that you've been involved in, but also your work with the virtual assets service provider sector as well. How do you see things today in terms of the progress that's been made towards effective policy and regulation for this sector?
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you, Afi. Good day to you all, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. You know, I'm in a fairly unusual situation of having been a poacher, and then a gamekeeper, and then a poacher again. I spent a lifetime's career as a technologist in a whole host of different industries, including banking in different parts of the world. But I ended up a few years ago in public policy, particularly relating to regulatory affairs, and particularly in relation to what at the time was just seen as virtual currencies, but what we now think of as a much broader range of crypto assets. And along the way, I was invited to become a regulator. I became the senior advisor on DLT, leading with a colleague, a team of 12 people on some custom regulation, new legislation that was brought in for this sector, for the DLT sector, all the way back in the beginning of 2018. Next slide, please. But I left public service around a year ago, and in fact, the last bit of work I undertook in public service was the FATF summer plenary last year, at which the policy development group's years worth of work on amending the FATF recommendations to include new definitions for virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, both of which are very broad, and ended up with the publication and approval of an interpretive note and the guidance, which has really been a threshold moment for the virtual asset industry and for these types of instruments. You know, the slide that you see there, "Wake up, smell the coffee," was a slide that was the first slide I produced once I'd left public service and gave a talk virtually straight after that plenary at the V20 alongside the G20 in Osaka last summer. And what I was signifying here was that virtual assets and this new category of virtual asset service provider had suddenly, after enjoying a number of years on the margins, was now suddenly being addressed. It was being addressed probably because of two things. Firstly, Libra had just been unleashed onto the world by Facebook and its partners. A so-called, as it's now described, a so-called global stablecoin, something to really challenge at scale some fiat currencies, and also because FATF had produced these rules for the sector. But you know, this change that had started from cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies and was now defined as virtual assets actually represented something that had grown from just a few dozen to a few hundred, now to thousands of different kinds of virtual assets, not just virtual currencies, and include in their broadest scope, certainly as crypto assets, these stable coins and global stable coins, and also central bank digital currencies. And as you would expect from a shake-up such as Libra, an initiative that was going to, that had the potential to represent a real threat to some fiat currencies and to central bank money, you now had a whole host of regulatory initiatives. I can't possibly list them all because in the last year we've had work by IOSCO, by the FSB, by FATF, by the European Union with a number of action plans, including an action plan on crypto assets. We've had initiatives from individual jurisdictions, Japan, Singapore, Germany, Switzerland, the UK, to name but just a few. Some of them, of course, are in response to the FATF initiatives, but many are moving well above and beyond, including matters of prudential and fitness. But the history of this FATF recommendation change is really one of a recognition that the AML-CFT implications had not been properly addressed. And the G20 had very rapidly asked FATF to address this issue and get back to it within short order of time, indeed within a year, with some policy responses. Personally, I regret the speed that we worked on this because I think we could have done so much more. And we had to find ways of shoehorning something that was essentially different into rules that were for the same. Next slide, please. There was this recognition that crypto is, of course, the same. It performs many of the same functions or some of them, or different types of crypto perform functions of other types of instruments, but they simply work differently. They presented in many cases some of the same risks, but also some unique risks, some unique challenges. And FATF was certainly very quick to recognize that there were differences. Take the travel rule, for example, because in addition to all the other requirements, such as that VASPs need to be licensed or registered, requirements for due diligence, and requirements for the wire transfer rule, for the travel rule, for the information about originators and beneficiaries to be transmitted between VASPs on VASP-to-VASP transactions. So it recognized there were differences. It said industry had to come up with solutions to some of these problems. And indeed, I led one of them in that I convened a working group, a joint working group from 3 established trade industry bodies who came together with their technical experts. In the end, we had about 130 technical experts. About half of them were from VASP, some from technical solution providers, some from regulators, some from traditional financial institutions. Came up with a universal data model, a common language, if you like, for sending that information by whichever method the industry chooses over time to come up with. And there will be many such solutions. There are already many such solutions in development. But the reality is that we can't necessarily always apply the same rules. Next slide, please. You know, this principle that we've had, and I had as a regulator, of same business, same risk, same rules, you know, I can't even figure out exactly where that came from. The reality is it's a very nuanced and far too simplified principle. Next slide, please. Because what it translates to is that when viewed from the traditional, when viewed from the incumbents, when viewed by regulators and policymakers who see the world as it already is, you end up with something that is same business, same risks, and same old rules. Take the FATF recommendations and the guidance. Much of it is really just taking the rules as they are and trying to make them fit. That old adage of round pegs into square holes, or is it square pegs into round holes? Definitely, this problem, as it was perceived from the existing and not from the new. And with that come all sorts of additional challenges when you see the potential for that innovation brings, for example, for financial inclusion, and yet somehow you're unable to accommodate them because you're locking them down with old rules, old ways of doing things, rules that were set in different technologies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I have a perspective on this, and it's really just something to make us think. I think that for sure, the same business that does indeed produce the same risks or present the same risks should have the same rules, but maybe those rules should be looked at from the perspective of the new. Maybe innovation, which affords us the opportunity to open up new benefits for society and for the financial industry, and indeed for methods of regulation, should be viewed at from the perspective of same rules, but from same new rules, and some of those new rules will have to be retrofitted to the existing traditional sectors. Next slide, please. There's one conclusion I came to at the V20, and that is that for sure, VASPs are now part of the global financial system. There is no escaping it. There is a plethora of legislation and regulation that is already coming out, in development, or about to hit the statute book and be applied by regulators. And it's not just going to affect virtual currencies. It's not just going to affect virtual assets, but it's also going to affect these new stable coins and even in a way, central bank digital currencies, new forms of fiat. And so, armed with that thought, I would pose a question. I would pose a question as if this is not the opportunity to look for new rules, create new rules to solve the old risks and the new risks, and thereby embrace and facilitate the innovation. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I've been able to help you catch up a minute or two, Robin.
Thanks so much, Siân, and that's really an excellent thought to conclude with. But I do want to ask you, you've highlighted that actually almost all of the standard setting bodies now have initiatives, work plans underway on virtual assets, and maybe we do have Libra to thank for that, at least in part. But it does seem to me that there probably are two different speeds at which those initiatives are progressing. So on the one hand, with the FATF, we have quite an urgent binding approach, and enforcement is coming, and there'll be stiff penalties for non-compliance. Whereas when it comes to the FSB, looking at financial stability implications, there's been quite a lengthy consultation process and so on. It seems maybe at a more considered pace that things are developing with the other SSBs. So I'd just like to ask, does that sort of two speed, two tracks going on, is that a problem? Because will it force regulators to act just looking at the AML-CFT dimension, but not necessarily regulating the sector holistically, and perhaps leading to unintended consequences as a result of that?
I think that's an immensely good question. And I think you're absolutely right. There are two speeds now, and I believe this is probably these last 3-4 years have probably represented a huge missed opportunity. So much fence sitting resulted in an overreaction, I think, a knee-jerk reaction, which has indeed resulted in some areas, particularly on AML-CFT. And I'm not pretending there aren't some very significant issues, but you know, crypto isn't actually very good for money laundering. You know, it's far too easy, as Liat has shown us, to catch criminals. It's far too easy to ascertain the provenance of value, and it's far too easy and quick to investigate. Look at the Twitter hack. What was it, 10 days? Liat, please correct me, but I think it was about 10 days from the event to folks getting arrested around the world. And that would simply not have been possible in the old world. Sure, it facilitates some stuff, but it also has some great opportunities. But overall, it doesn't represent. You know, there isn't the evidence, I believe, the evidence base to have justified this this reaction. But you're right. One consequence is that there is a mandatory speed that's been set by, you know, by the quasi-treaty status that FATF recommendations have, and they cannot be ignored. They have to be responded to. But I think there are still opportunities for smarter regulation and more reasoned approaches in the prudential and conduct space. I think some countries have tagged on their conduct and prudential regulation very, very rapidly to what they're doing on AML-CFT, and I believe that that may be a mistake. That is that's the golden opportunity really now to address some of the other integrity issues, and then maybe go back and revisit ways in which the FATF recommendations can still be complied with. But you make an excellent point.
Thanks very much for that, Siân. Time is rather against us, but we do have about 10 minutes or so still for additional questions. So if you have further questions, do type them into the Q&A. And I would like to ask one question. actually that has come into the Q&A around the role of virtual assets in financial inclusion. And the comment is that my view is that crypto tends to favor the already well-off people compared to poor men and women in rural areas. What's really the contribution to financial inclusion? So clearly, some people would like still a little more convincing that there are tangible financial inclusion use cases, and particularly that those sort of marginalized individuals and communities, maybe with low levels of digital literacy, can they really benefit from this? So I'd like to throw that open to any of the panel that would like to make a stab at that.
Well, if I may be controversial and suggest that the financial inclusion benefits of crypto is still largely theoretical, with some exceptions. You know, where was it 2009 the first Bitcoin transaction took place, so we're well over 10 years, and we have yet to see serious compelling use cases. So what we've had is a lot of speculation, and with a lot of speculation we've ended up with, as has been pointed out by the questioner, something which has hugely benefited those who already have money in the developed world particularly, and has not yet allowed the killer app, the unequivocal killer use case from emerging. Undoubtedly, that killer use case is likely to be in the of benefit to those who are currently financially excluded, but it has yet to happen, and there are still many obstacles. So the observation, I believe, is probably correct. It has to date benefited largely the well-off, and it has yet to benefit those for whom it offers so much promise.
Thank you. Jay, you've unmuted. Would you like to come in there?
Sure. And look, I think if from the industry we were being candid, there'd be a recognition that what Sean just mentioned is correct as of today. But I would add two nuances to that. One is that Bitcoin itself has certain technological limitations that make it not as potentially useful in a financial inclusion setting. And that's why some of the newer technologies that are emerging, and that's why I wanted to walk through kind of some of the features of the platform that we're working on. But I think, to be candid, it would be shared by others that are developing other platforms. But the importance of being able to use stable value assets is incredibly important, because otherwise it turns into a speculative game. And so I think the development of stable coins is an incredibly important development to keep in mind. And as regulators, I would encourage regulators to look holistically and nuanced at this space so that you don't stifle innovation, because this has the real potential to address some of the gaps. So that's number one. Two is the data intensity of Bitcoin is just a problem. I mean, it's an issue of environmental proportions, and it's an issue of, can you actually use these things on devices that most people in the world who are financially excluded have? And so that's, again, an enormous area of research and development in the industry, which is being able to use these on data limited in phones. And the reality is that right now, they're smartphones, but even on our platform, there's development going on to be used on feature phones. And because of the advanced nature of the development, the amount of data that's needed now to manage these blockchains on Celo, for example, is really, really small and can be managed on data limited phones. The third thing I would say is, as ease of use, which is also, I think, being addressed in a number of ways, but the advantage potential advantage of crypto is that it can actually replace cash in situations, and that's why I use the examples that I did, in situations where somebody would want a bearer instrument other than cash that's more traceable, that's more fraud resistant, that can be targeted and programmed. And that's really the potential for this. So I agree it's a potential, but it's an enormous potential to be able to create a bearer asset that's digitally programmable. And I do think that we're on the cusp if regulators are able to exercise some forbearance in this space and let new rules develop, to Sean's point, because I think that's really important. We shouldn't be trying to shoehorn this into old rules, but to really understand the technology and create new rules that really manage the risk of a programmable digital bearer instrument, which I think has tremendous implications for financial inclusion. And I would draw a distinction, but therefore, between what we've seen and what we're now seeing in the development in this space. But that's kind of from the industry perspective.
Thank you. There's a specific question that's come in for Mel. Was it necessary to change the primary financial sector laws to require registration and supervision of virtual assets providers? What specific tools are used to supervise the market players in terms of both on-site inspections and off-site analysis? Mel?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the regulation of VCEs were folded in the MSB framework of the BSP. So we just use the existing framework to regulate virtual currency exchanges back then in 2017. So in term, you mentioned about the supervisory tools. I mentioned about on-site examination, off-site surveillance, supervision, regular submission of reports, regular meetings with players, and soon, within this year, we will also implement a blockchain analysis tool that will help us, that will strengthen, hopefully, will strengthen our surveillance capability.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring in Liat as well on the question of financial inclusion contribution, which you mentioned you'd like to say a few words on, Liat.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question and something that I certainly think about a lot. So just by way of kind of brain waves of what's on my mind on this. So crypto asset stablecoins, it's new. It requires a whole of government, an entire ecosystem, and the partnerships between industry and private public sector and so on. There's a whole lot of different components that need to align. But very quick, tangible steps that we should and can be taking are, for example, to stretch our existing concepts of financial literacy. So financial literacy right now, essentially will mean reading bank statements, understanding how to, do financials. I think we could really expand on that and better provide services that, reference back to how do you use your mobile phone in order to do, run your business, to do remittances differently. And so the concept of financial literacy can certainly be expanded, and that's on all the international organizations to support. A second piece is financial inclusion is traditionally being measured by access to financial institutions and banks. And how it is that we measure financial inclusion and accessibility can also be expanded to be inclusive of crypto instruments and so on. I think what's particularly unique about crypto is that it doesn't operate within the same space as banks, and so those kinds of fees don't apply. And regulators have a role to play in how it is that they crack the code of allowing crypto to flourish within their own legal systems that also marries up to financial inclusion. So it's a way it's setting up the rules within a particular country, but also a whole of government and ecosystem maturity and mainstreaming. And there are a lot of these big adoption projects, Libra as being one of them, that are well on the way of doing that. And so I think we all have kind of a role to play, but I really see wide scale adoption as something that has obviously not yet happened. And so I would agree with John's comment on this. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'd just like to ask one final question to the panel before we wrap up. We've talked about many different trends that we're seeing. The emergence of stable coins has been very pronounced. The interest in central bank digital currencies is getting stronger and stronger. But in other direction, we're also seeing decentralized finance projects, proliferating. So I'd just like to get the panel's view. What should we kind of look out for here in terms of developments over the next few years? Are we going to see one sort of model here win out, or are we going to see all these things, CBDC, stable coins, Bitcoin and so on, all kind of continuing to exist and be part of one ecosystem? So any views on that would be really appreciated. Jay, I think you were fastest to unmute.
Sure, I'm willing to give. I'll be quick. I think the reality is that as with any innovative space, I think there's going to be parallel developments. I don't see a single thing yet displacing anything else, because there isn't a standard, and innovation in this space is very, very rapid. And so I think that given those two features, I don't think you'll see a sort of dominance yet emerge. Having said that, I think the trends that one should look for are similar to what's happened in the internet, because if you think about what's happening, it's really, the blockchain just, one way of thinking about it is it's a secure layer on top of the internet that marries the instantaneous nature of information with the instantaneous transfer of value, and more importantly, because of the nature of the ledger, accounting. And so information and value now can be transmitted in the same way over the internet. What that has led to in the information space is disintermediation. And I think that whatever policies put into place, you're likely to see further disintermediation. I don't think that means that banks disappear tomorrow. In fact, they have proved resilient in adapting to the environments around them. But I do think that you are going to see disintermediation, and from a policymaker or regulator's perspective, I would start thinking seriously about how do you think about regulation in a disintermediated world, even gradually disintermediating world, that doesn't get rid of ultimate end users' privacy, which is one world we could go to, which I think needs to be thought about early on, which is how do we balance concerns about surveillance, which you've seen are very powerful, with concerns about privacy, which I think will become the big issue that crops up over the next generation. So I would focus on things such as disintermediation and the importance of preserving privacy in the future, and figuring out how we marry concerns around surveillance and AML with issues of individual autonomy and privacy.
Excellent, thank you. Sean, would you like to go next?
Well, again, I'm likely to be a little controversial here, but I don't think crypto is the driver for shrinking financial privacy. The demands for that from policymakers and regulators for a variety of different reasons are very real, and they're being, if anything, facilitated by crypto of one sort or another. Think about what is likely to be a dominant central bank digital currency coming out of Asia, a very real prospect which will affect all of its trading partners and eventually be ubiquitous. We have seen the shrinking of privacy in traditional banking, with some countries in the developed world already, in the high-income world, already making effectively cash a thing of the past. You try and go and pay for anything in the street, in a shop, in a taxi, in Denmark, with notes or coins today. In terms of disintermediation, that is, of course, the holy grail for all this crypto. The reality is it's not going to disintermediate very much at all. It's just going to bring a new set of actors into play. Some of them already exist, others will come, and some will be created by policymakers and regulators who will simply deem new classes of actors as being intermediaries rather than somehow being disinterested external parties. And finally, I think it's a big risk, big danger to think of this stuff just in terms of cryptocurrencies, virtual currencies. course, we're not just talking Bitcoin and a few hundred, if not 1,000, virtual currencies of one sort or another, but we're also thinking about everything that could be an asset, being capable of being securitized and digitized, and the very real prospect that that will, in 10, 15 years time, maybe sooner, permeate throughout all financial markets, financial infrastructure, and the traditional financial world. Virtual assets, assets should definitely not be thought of as one thing. There are a succession of next big things that have happened and next big things to happen, and some that I can't even dream about as I'm going to retire in a few years' time. And they will continue to happen, and they'll happen in all sorts of directions, and they'll happen concurrently. It just represents new ways of doing old stuff. But new ways offer the potential for new benefits, and it's those that we should try and seize upon and not focus on all the downsides of the past. We're not terribly good at looking after AML-CFT already in the traditional world. We should use this as an opportunity to do it a lot better.
Terrific, thank you. And Liat, anything finally you'd like to highlight looking forward?
Sure, just quite briefly to say that I think one of the key terms and buzzwords would be interoperability. As Sean has just mentioned, it's this notion that it's not going to be just crypto, just stable coins, just banks or cash that are here. They're all here and they're coexisting. And how is it that the regulators are able to bring enough detail and clarity that's needed? I often parallel this to a prenuptial agreement, the clearer that the regulators can be about what the do's and don'ts are and how the system is to be harmonized in terms of a financial ecosystem that also relies on this notion of interoperability and being able to move back and forth between different assets and instruments. And so I think regulators will be one of the most important kind of linchpin here, and the partnerships that are created with industry. I think industries will continue to innovate at breakneck speed, and that's exciting and amazing. But the dialogue that must happen between the public and private sectors on this, and the way that that dialogue is handled, issues are aired and then addressed practically and ironed out. I think that's where we live and win. So in those areas of communication and coordination.
That's a great point. Thank you. And Mel, I'll offer the last word to you. We just heard that regulators are the linchpin. Any final sort of word of advice for fellow regulators on this webinar, what to look out for?
Yeah. In terms of what to look out for in the financial ecosystem, I think we have been seeing the emergence of fintech and particularly big techs, which are challenging existing or traditional players. So for the traditional players, there's really no room for complacency. And it's also important for the regulators, to always adopt an open and flexible mindset. Siân mentioned about you don't need to insist on old rules for new concepts. So I think it's important that the regulator should have a dynamic and proactive policy framework. And I think capacity building is also key. Our supervision will soon be anchored on technology. And of course, we need to also keep on training, because at the end of the day, we cannot regulate what we don't understand.
Thanks so much. That's a great point to leave it on. So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. Thanks everyone for staying a little bit over the allotted time. And I think we've had a really rich and fruitful discussion of the topic before us today. I won't try and summarize because there's too much rich content there, but just to say on inclusion, I think it's clear that there is a openness to the role that the virtual asset sector can play, but still a need perhaps to demonstrate more and more the practical use cases and the real tangible benefit. So that's something we need to look out for and document. And in terms of the integrity aspect, there's a real need to foster peer learning around both our regulators, but also the industry itself, tackling those that set of challenges. But above all, I think there's been a really strong demand for more global coordination, for more global dialogue, both in terms of peer learning amongst regulators, but also between regulators, the private sector, and the standard setters as well, to really build technical knowledge in this area and understand the policy choices and tools available to us. And as AFI, we'll certainly be happy to play our part in that, and really look forward to continuing this conversation with our partners. But for today, thank you so much. Wherever in the world you have been joining from, please do stay safe and well, and keep in touch. Thank you, and for now, goodbye.